Hi there, thanks for tuning into this short video on reframing, which I think is really the heart of therapy. I'm going to take you through three reframes I've used with clients for dealing with criticism and confidence issues. But just in case you're not sure what reframing is, in its simplest form for our purposes here, it's just how you change the emotional meaning someone attaches to something, which of course is what therapy is really all about. So here's a quick true story just to show how beautiful and powerfully effective a well-delivered reframe can be. And it's about an old man who went to see a therapist for help with his terrible grief. So this old man had been married for many decades, maybe 50 years, but his wife had died a few months before, and he was now suffering terribly. The old grieving man told the therapist that he had always tried to protect his wife from suffering, but now, after she was gone, after 50 years together, his life had no meaning. What was the point of his life now? What was the point of all this misery? Now, the therapist didn't immediately contradict this, but after some time had elapsed, and at a suitable moment, the therapist clearly said to the old man, "You know, you always protected your wife. Throughout her life, you shielded her the best you could from suffering. You tried to always shield her from suffering, from pain. Tell me now one thing. How would she now be had you been the first to die? Would she now be suffering?" And the old man stopped and really thought about this, and eventually, after much introspection, replied that yes, his wife would have suffered greatly, perhaps even more than he himself was now suffering, had he died first, rather than her. The therapist then said clearly to the man that in fact his current suffering did have meaning. He was still protecting his wife, even now. And of course, because of the rapport between the old man and the therapist, and the way the reframe was delivered, the old man now had at least a real and positive purpose for his suffering, that of protecting his wife even now. He was suffering, so she didn't have to. Now, the man didn't immediately stop grieving, but he did stop feeling hopeless and depressed, and bit by bit began to connect with life again, to get back involved in his community and to find more purpose again in his life, in large part because he could now assign valuable meaning to his grief. It now had a purpose, because feeling something is entirely without meaning can be the hardest thing to bear. And the therapist, by the way, was Viktor Frankl, who himself survived years in Nazi concentration camps during World War II. And this story comes from his book, Man's Search for Meaning, which I heartily recommend. And I think it's a neat example of a well-delivered and timely therapeutic reframe. Okay, so we know that the meaning we stick onto stuff that happens to us can determine whether we depress or become angry or afraid or hopeless or hopeful. And the very best alleviators of human suffering, the best practitioners, will either be naturally good at reframing because they've developed creative and flexible thinking and know how to communicate really effectively, or they'll have been really well trained in the subtle art of reframing when they were training to be a psychotherapist, although thorough training in this skill seems to be pretty rare, perhaps because it can be a slippery fish to grasp. It can be an intuitive art as well as a practical science. So it's important to understand that emotional pain comes partly from how we view or frame our reality. And the way we frame our reality is determined in large part by our current emotional state, past emotional conditioning, and the way we generally learned to approach the world. This is why a depressed person may react negatively to something others see as a good thing, because it's not the thing itself that matters, so much as how their mind is distorting or bending the reality of that thing to fit their pre-existing state of mind. Depressed people will constantly be reframing. They'll be reframing neutral or even potentially positive events as threatening or negative. This is not a conscious reframing, of course, but it is happening. They're doing negative reframing without knowing it. Someone with low self-esteem will bend reality to fit their prevailing ideology, as will an angry person. In a sense, all psychological problems, other than perhaps psychosis, require a loss of flexible response to life's ups and downs. So, just like when light enters a prism and light is bent, in the same way strong, locked emotional states bend the meaning of things coming into the mind in the direction that reinforces the bias of the problem. When we're angry, then anything can make us angry. If we're clinically depressed, angry, or anxious, then a part of our mind behaves like a dictatorship, limiting the type of information or biasing our interpretation of the incoming information. Only propaganda that fits the depressive ideology is really permitted into the system, and any conflicting evidence may be suppressed by the depressive state. When we reframe effectively, we need to do it in such a way that we can, if you like, get past the filters or the guards of depression or low self-esteem and help the person start to see the problem from a wider perspective. A perspective that is bigger than, but still contains, the problem. But I'm keen to emphasize that reframing isn't just a beneficial rearrangement of thinking, but also, or perhaps more so, a change in feeling towards something so that it never seems so bad again. Great reframing is never just a question of trying to force someone to think differently, because problem states aren't logical constructs, but happen and are maintained on the level of feeling, of emotion. So really a therapist or friend or lover or parent or even a stranger that lends a helping hand needs to know how to reframe in such a way that it causes a feeling impact that can also appeal to logic, but is primarily something that appeals to the feelings of the person, because that's what's going to make the new frame of reference compelling in such a way that the person can never go back to the old, limited way of perceiving the situation ever again. So let's look at 3 examples that show emotional impacts of reframes. Okay, reframe 1, dealing with criticism. So Penny was a newly qualified teacher whose confidence was being severely dented by the continuous criticism she was receiving from an older colleague. When she came to see me, it was clear that she was eager to learn her work. She was open to constructive criticism, but this co-worker's constant and negative criticism was all a bit much and was damaging her self-esteem. And we spoke about how sometimes people who've been overly criticized in the past have thoroughly digested the criticism. In other words, they've swallowed it so that it's become part of their identity and can begin to damage their self-esteem. So I framed, or I should say reframed, criticism as something that she could choose to chew over, to swallow and digest, or to not even put into herself in the first place. And she readily accepted this new frame, this analogy, if you like. Of course, the person who was or is doing the criticizing may well have some fair points, but if criticism consists mainly of negative overgeneralizations, then it will be of limited nutritional value, so to speak. It may even be counterproductive to someone who's already emotionally distressed. It can end up being more like poison than nutrition. At the right time, I framed the work criticism as something Penny could choose to consume or not. I described to her that we could decide whether we wanted to own criticisms or not, to make them part of ourselves or not. I also spoke of the choice between swallowing a criticism and just chewing it over for a while before deciding you don't actually like it and then spitting it out. When she came back, she reported that she felt criticism had been, and I think her choice of language was interesting here, offered to her, but it was now up to her to take it or not. She also reported the Critical person had seemed to pick up, almost intuitively, her newfound confidence and was now treating her better, which made me very happy to hear as well. Reframe 2, confidence issues. Now, the second example relates a little bit to the first. It's about the very common problem of low self-confidence. My client Linda was a high achiever in her chosen career, but needed help. Although she was highly competent at work, she vividly described to me how uncomfortable and nervous she always felt whenever she was in the presence of someone she deemed to be better than her in some way, whether they were prettier in her estimation, or cleverer, or paid more, or whatever. At the point at which I felt she would be most open to a new frame of reference around this issue, I looked at her and I said, "You know, Linda, you're a very competitive person, and in many ways that's a good thing because it's taken you so far in life, and it will take you further. But any tool, and I mean absolutely any tool, can be misapplied and overused. What you call your troubling occasional lack of social confidence could easily be described as misapplied competitiveness." Now, for Linda, this was an entirely fresh way of viewing her feelings in such situations, and helped to begin to lose the overly black and white perspectives that she'd been applying. She now began to think in terms of misapplied competitiveness rather than social anxiety, which is a more enabling frame than lack of confidence. She stopped even thinking about how she compared with others. She left that kind of competitiveness and feeling that she was somehow losing out to other people behind, and started enjoying a much more comfortable life in her social situations. Reframe 3, confidence in abilities. And the final reframe story is one I used with a client suffering from confidence issues. In this case, it was specifically about her work. So this client, Lucy, was a young art student, and she was full of creative ideas, but had very little confidence in her ideas. So she'd feel crushed if anyone so much as hinted that her ideas maybe weren't so great. She'd immediately lose confidence in them altogether. During our initial talk, I discovered that she was godmother to her best friend's children. She talked very enthusiastically about that. So we talked about how important it was to nurture and protect children, championing them until such time as they could run on their own and survive independently. I then began, in and out of hypnotic trance, to reframe her creative, artistic ideas as needing to be nurtured, respected, and taken care of, just like young children, until such times as they were robust enough to take care of themselves in the world. She could be protective of and stand up for her ideas the way she might look after her godchildren. Now, this metaphor really appealed to Lucy because it could be connected to an area of her life that she felt really good about, being a godmother to her friends' children. I changed her frame of reference from having a lack of confidence in her ideas to them needing to be protected, nurtured, and mothered by her until they were ready to stand on their own 2 feet. She began to feel more confident in her ideas because of this new frame. I also suggested that ideas, once in the world, don't just belong to one person anymore, so she should look after them until they could work independently in their world. She could be proud of them, but also recognize their independence and autonomy. This reframe worked for Lucy. She immediately felt less embarrassed about her ideas and more protective of them, because ideas take on a life of their own. Well, I hope these 3 real-life reframes have helped you see how powerful this skill is. If you'd like to be able to reframe messy, stressful situations for your clients so they very quickly feel much better with a clearer, more positive perspective on the world, then keep your eye on your inbox because I'll be sending you more information on how to learn reframing very shortly.